Alright, so hey everyone. Today I want to take a look at the dead zones for some of the quote-unquote more modern classic Doom ports. So the versions included will be the ones from the Doom 3 and Resurrection of Evil, the on the Xbox, the BFG edition on the 360, as well as the PC. The Doom Unity port, as well as the Nightdive remaster for the Xbox One and Series consoles. So what we have right here is the version on the Doom 3 Collector's Edition, though this is identical to Resurrection of Evil. So starting with that, we have a 28% axial dead zone for movement. And because it's an axial dead zone, this restricts diagonal movement around the axes, the width of the dead zone. So you have to, so in this case, I'm moving perfectly forward and perfectly backward. And you don't start seeing diagonal movement occur until you break out of both axis dead zones, which is represented by these green regions. And there's not a whole lot of space in this area, so one of the ways to kind of more easily show this is to run up against a wall and move past this threshold, and you can see when that triggers a little more clearly. Getting a little stuck on that. And similarly around the vertical axis, try to adjust myself so that I'm pretty well into it. Drifting a little forward, but diagonal movement is strong enough to make this threshold very clear. Movement appears to be digital, meaning that there's no speed difference when moving past the dead zone. So you can see I'm moving right past the dead zone here, and I'm moving the same speed here as I would with a full stick tilt. And the diagonals being very abrupt could suggest that we just have 8 directions available. So this is set up like a D-pad or like a WSAD or the arrow keys would be. So we have 8 directions and 1 speed available, or 2 if you include the sprint speed. For the camera, we have the same 28% axial dead zone, but since there's no vertical view in Doom, we don't have that component here. The acceleration curve for the camera actually starts at about 5% of its total speed and increases following a quadratic curve. This curve, the tested points seem to match a quadratic curve scaled to an 8% dead zone. So it seems like there's an underlying 8% dead zone, and then there's an additional dead zone being placed on top of that, which is digging into the curve and removing those subtle values. So this isn't ideal because those precise values are completely inaccessible, but some things that mitigate that is one, it's only 5%, which is actually quite a bit, but the general sensitivity is quite slow. You can see that what you're seeing here is there's no sensitivity options available, but your maximum turn speed is 125 degrees per second. This can be increased by sprinting. As long as you're holding the button, the sensitivity actually doubles to 250 degrees per second. And if I release the sprint button, you can see that it halves and then doubles once I repress it. So you can make small adjustments, though not as small as you could if this wasn't restricted in this way. But that covers it for this version. We'll jump over to the 360 BFG Edition version. Alright, so we're here in the Doom BFG Edition on the 360, and as you can see, this is an updated port, so we have a bit more better resolution here. But otherwise, the Deadzones curve and sensitivity are pretty much identical to the Xbox version. So we can see that we have a 28% axial dead zone still applied for movement. And this still restricts diagonal movement around the axes, so I'm moving perfectly forward here. But when I break into the green region, you can see diagonal movement pretty clearly begin. And again, we'll borrow this green armor station to see the thresholds a little more clearly. And we can see the vertical transition in the same way, trying to line ourselves up with the wall. And looking for this threshold. You might have noticed there that the passing the threshold wasn't as abrupt as it was in the previous version, and there does seem to be some movement granularity added to this version. So when I just pass over the dead zone, I start moving slower than in the previous version, and as I move the stick further, you can see that it speeds up to the normal walking speed. So there is some kind of gradient here. And with the diagonals, they're not as abrupt as they were before, that you can still see a clear transition, but it's definitely not the jump it was in the previous version. They do still, movement does start faster than 0, as well as the diagonals, and this could be done similar to the curve previously, where the dead zone is cropping in and eating some of the slower movement speeds that could be accessible if the movement curve were scaled with this 28% dead zone. And similarly, the diagonals could be more abrupt because the subtle diagonals are being dug into with this dead zone as well. But this does have quite a bit more granularity than the previous version. Otherwise, the camera is the same as it was, a 28% axial dead zone. And the curve is also identical. It starts at about 5% of your total turn speed, and then follows a quadratic curve. This quadratic curve, again, seems to be scaled around an 8% dead zone, with an additional dead zone cropping off the early part of the curve. The sensitivity here is, again, 125 degrees per second. Unless you're sprinting, then it jumps to 250. So exactly the same as the previous port. So overall, it's very closely the same as the previous version, but just slightly updated a bit. But now to move on to the PC version of the BFG edition. Alright, so this is the PC version of the BFG edition, and we have substantially different dead zones here. So for movement, we have about 37% somewhat circular dead zone. I've called this dead zone shape a bloated square before. It looks pretty circular here, but that's because the axial portion of the dead zone is very small. But you might be able to see that just in the corners, this moves to a very subtle point. But for the angular restriction, this is not a flat threshold like it was in the previous ports, but instead it's most restricted right around the dead zone. So I can point the stick at a clear angle like this and I'm moving forward, but if I move into the screen region, I can start moving diagonally. I'll use this armor stand again to demonstrate the full stick movements, and this is much less restricted at full stick tilt. You can see that it's just a few percent before diagonal movement begins. But as you move closer to the dead zone, this range increases. Then meets at the corners to try to demonstrate the vertical threshold. We have backwards movement, or backwards diagonal movement, forwards diagonal movement. Now, it might be pretty obvious here, but these moving past this threshold is nowhere near as dramatic as the previous ports, and it seems that movement granularity has been increased dramatically. So you can see that moving just past the dead zone you move very slowly, and moving the stick further as you increase in movement speed. And if you sprint, this range is widest, so I'm holding the sprint button right now, but you can see that I'm moving very slow past the dead zone, and as I move the stick further, I have pretty much a full range of movement speeds to choose from. With diagonal movement seeing a little noticeable when passing this threshold, it could be that this axial dead zone is still could still be cropping some of the subtle angles, but because, especially at full stick tilt movements, the range is so small, you're losing nowhere near as much as previous ports. The camera has a similar shape, except much less of an axial restriction. So we have a bit of an kind of almond or eye shape here, but this is just short of 22% for the camera dead zone, and sort of an oblong shape to exit it with diagonal movements. But you can see moving pretty vertically, you only have to pass the axis basically before you switch directions. Of course, in Doom, you're just looking left and right, so really only the horizontal threshold really matters. But for the acceleration curve, again, we have a quadratic curve, and this actually seems to be mapped to a 20% dead zone. So this additional about 1.7-ish% does appear to be eating into the curve, but since that distance from 20% at a quadratic curve is so slow, it really makes no difference in this case. Otherwise, it increases as expected. So it starts out very slow and then builds up pretty quickly towards the end until your maximum turn rate. So the sensitivity is much faster in this compared to the previous ports. By default, it's 400 degrees per second, and this is actually the sensitivity for the Doom 3 BFG edition. This is much faster than the maximum of 250 degrees of the previous ports. but there is no sprint modifier, so if you hold the sprint button, it's the same exact speed. So I'm holding it right now, released it, hold it right now, released it. It's exactly the same, so the sprinting does not affect your sensitivity at all. So on the whole, this is a decent improvement over previous. We have a more radial deadzone size. This deadzone is actually larger than the previous versions, but we do have much less restricted diagonal movement, and we have much more granularity both in starting movement speed as well as subtle angles accessible. For the camera, we both have a smaller deadzone, which is nice, but also while it seems very slightly cropped, very functionally, we have a properly scaled quadratic curve, so we can make very small adjustments if we wanted to. But otherwise, we'll be moving on to the Unity port. Alright, so this is the Doom Unity version, or the 2019 release. This was released for the Xbox One. This is being demonstrated on the Xbox Series X, but the deadzones are identical between the two. And we can see pretty similar deadzones here compared to the PC BFG, but the movement deadzone specifically is much smaller, even though the shape is broadly similar. So this is about a 23% deadzone, and it's pretty circular, but the corners move to very shallow corners, and the same flared restriction applies as the PC BFG. So if your stick is right around the deadzone, it's most restricted, and you can see straight, but by moving the screen region, you start moving diagonally. And to just demonstrate using this trusty armor stand, again, we have a no diagonal movement, leftward, rightward, and this gets slightly larger as we get closer to the deadzone. And it's identical for the vertical axis, so I'll skip it for now. For the camera, again, a similar shape to the PC BFG. However, the axial portion extends to the top more significantly. So we have about a 22% deadzone horizontally, and of course it blends inward. But just a bit of a deadzone along the rest of the horizontal axis. So not too much different, but again, you're mostly going to be hovering around the vertical axis, so these vertical sections aren't going to matter at all. The acceleration curve is again quadratic. This is exactly identical to the PC BFG, down to this apparent the curve apparently scaling with a 20% deadzone. So this additional deadzone seems to crop into it very slightly, but at those small values with a quadratic curve, the amount of speed lost is extremely negligible. If this used a linear curve, it would be. It would start, you'd lose about 2% of your speed, which doesn't sound like a lot, but would be more significant. But here, it's really not an issue whatsoever. Where it differs is in sensitivity. First off, support is the first to give sensitivity options. So at the maximum sensitivity, this is about 390 degrees per second. So just short of what the PC BFG edition had. At the minimum sensitivity, This has about 78, 79 degrees per second. So you can see this is quite slow, but this means the slider has a pretty decent range. I don't know what the default was, I assume it's right in the middle, but testing that, this gave about 204 degrees per second. So that would put it just below the sprint boosted sensitivity of the Xbox and 360 ports. So there's a decent sensitivity range on offer here. And overall, this is pretty comparable to the PC BFG edition, except that the movement dead zone has been made quite a bit smaller, which is pretty nice. And because of that, while the restriction does still scale or flare out with the closer you get to the dead zone, because it's smaller, the absolute range of the stick that's limited to 1 of 4 directions is reduced, so you functionally have quite a bit more diagonal movement accessible to you than in the PC BFG version, though these are overall quite similar. But that covers it, so now we'll move on to the most recent port. Alright, so this is the current Nightdive remaster. I've already done a full video covering this, so if you want a more detailed video, you can look at that. Otherwise, I'm going to skim through this pretty quickly. For the movement, we have a sort of squarish shaped dead zone. It's slightly rounded with these notches in the corners. It's a little difficult to show the notches specifically in this video, but you can see the restriction, at least right around the dead zone, is very similar to what we've seen with the other past 2 types of dead zones, except there's a bulb this time around, and we're going to use again this trusty armor shelf. So you can see this bulb of restriction being applied, and movement is pretty abrupt, suggesting that this is unscaled, so you just lose whatever subtle angles were in here. You can see with this a little neck portion how slow the movement begins. So this, if it's unscaled at this point, you're losing very little, but as you move towards the dead zone, it flares out. And this little bulb doesn't apply to, oops, sensitive. Doesn't apply to the vertical axis, so you can see when passing this threshold, it's pretty narrow, similar to past 2 versions, and again flares out near the dead zone. For the camera, we have a radial dead zone for the center of it. And there's some angular restriction across the horizontal axis. And this restriction is unscaled, so that's why it starts abruptly here. This angular restriction isn't going to matter for the most part, because again, you're just going to be moving pretty well horizontally, so you'll never really interact with that. But the acceleration curve is an exponential, and it starts out pretty slow, but then builds up faster as you move the stick further. Until it hits a shaded region, which represents a jump in turn speed, and then increases gradually until the maximum stick tilt. So this is the first version that has dead zone options, And you can see here that the right stick is accurate to the size, but the left stick is always larger than this for whatever reason. But if we look at the maximums, change the graph, we can see that the movement keeps its general shape. It's a little more rounded than it was before, but it's still larger than what the option indicates. I'll skip demonstrating the restriction here for time, but it's generally the same as it was before. The camera is accurate, so now have a 50% radial dead zone. The restriction scales with the dead zone size, so this is more restricted, and you can see that it starts even more abrupt here because it's being unscaled and we're moving further. And because we're moving further, much more has been lost. But again, in this case, we're just going to be moving left and right, so that won't affect anything there. The curve is affected by the dead zone size, however, and the larger the dead zone, the slower it starts. So this starts slower than it did at the default dead zone size, but then builds up near the edge of stick tilt, and this also pushes out the acceleration jump. So there's a small jump in acceleration and a tiny bit more where it increases until it caps out. To look at the minimum, you can see that movement again is larger than what the option says, and at this point it's at its most square shape. But we can see that the bulb has extended down quite a bit, and you can see the curve issue present right here, so I probably won't be able to demonstrate it as I'd like. We'll let it be then. You can look at my other video if you want to see the restriction for that. But for the camera, this is accurate. So we have a small radial dead zone in the beginning, and you can see that because the restriction scales with the dead zone size, we have very limited restriction at this size, and it doesn't start as abruptly as the default or the maximum because while it's unscaled, you're not losing a whole lot, so it can start slower. Again, you'll be mostly moving around the vertical axis, so you won't really engage with that. However, the curve, as demonstrated right there, was scales dramatically with the dead zone, and at 5%, this starts very fast and is almost like a root curve. This pushes the acceleration jump inward, so this triggers much sooner. And then once that acceleration jump, it continues to taper off until its maximum turn rate. So as far as the sensitivity on offer, by default, this is set to 25, and this is the default is about 226 degrees, so this is just slightly slower than the sprint accelerated or sprint increased version of the Xbox and 360 ports. At its maximum, we have about 790 degrees per second. So this is nearly double what the previous Unity and PC BFG ports had. And at minimum, we have about 39 degrees per second. So this version has the widest sensitivity range. The only other game that had sensitivity was the Unity port, but this has a much wider range than that. Now, that about covers things. So if I was to compare just the Deadzones by themselves, I probably would place the Doom Unity port as the best, simply because it has the least amount of restriction. This Nightdive version is easily the best overall port and has the most options available. Deadzone options are excellent, but because it affects the curve so dramatically, it makes the benefit of smaller dead zones. It loses the benefit of smaller dead zones because it makes the acceleration nearly uncontrollable. So I think that the Unity version is just more consistent because of that. The benefit, however, as some subjective portion of it, is players who find the quadratic curve too slow in the other ones. Lowering the dead zone actually can mitigate that dramatically. This isn't going to be accurate to the graph. While this probably doesn't go through a perfect linear curve, lowering the dead zone can get you closer to that, and if that's your preferred curve, this is a way to do that. Most ideally, this would, be independent so that your dead zone wouldn't affect the curve, and you'd have a separate curve slider to customize the curve you want. But if you prefer those, this can end up feeling better than Unity based on personal preference. One thing that I didn't bring up in a video on this was the restriction, and I will bring up the Deadzones to 50 to demonstrate this, is that I had thought one of the potential benefits of the restriction is you can't see the vertical restriction because there's no vertical movement, it's just being voided. But you can, this would have been symmetric like it is in the Quake titles. And alright, so I had spent the next few minutes poorly explaining what I wanted to. Basically what I was trying to get at was if you want to move at 100% of horizontal speed or 100% of your vertical speed, you have to move the stick normally, perfectly horizontally or perfectly vertically to get that. If you move diagonally at all, you get a combination of both. So what you see here is, I'm moving the stick 100% horizontally, but about 35% vertically. But you can see if we take the normalized maximum, we're getting an output speed that fits right along this output circle. So you can't get 100% horizontal speed with any diagonal movement. However, if you restrict diagonal movement, you can see that, of course, within this range, you're just moving horizontally, but I can point the stick diagonally and still get a horizontal movement as I, maximum horizontal movement as I pass out the outer dead zone. And of course, you don't start seeing that start being deferred until you break out of this restriction. I thought it might be interesting if this was the case in the in this version, but it actually isn't. Even though there's some restriction, it could be that the way it's implemented, that it's not scaled, or perhaps they're restricting it after the output values or whatever. But how it works in this Nightdive version is it works exactly as expected. So if you move your stick to this position, you get these expected speeds out. And that's perfectly expected because if you set up, most aiming systems are set up with horizontal and vertical movement. And for a game like Doom, you're just cutting off the vertical section, or you're taking that system, cutting off the vertical, and applying that. So nothing wrong with that. I just thought it would be interesting to see what they've done. And of course, as you can see here, most players, you're going to play Doom, the stick left and right, and you're going to hit, you're probably not going to hit the axis perfectly, but you're going to get it pretty close, and you're still going to get, 98, 97% of your total speed. So having it lock, directly to 100%, or being able to access perfectly 100% of your horizontal speed isn't really going to be noticeable at all. So that was just a little tangent that I had went on. Otherwise, those are the Deadzones for these Doom ports. The Nightdive version is, of course, the most recent released one, so perhaps with any updates, these Deadzones could be subject to change, but as of making this video, they're the same as they were on launch. But otherwise, that covers things. So thanks for watching, and everyone, have a great rest of your day.